Good afternoon. My name is Jan Dahlman. I'm coordinator for this session, but we have some announcements first. First of all, welcome. We're very happy that you are here. And for those in the room, please take out your cell phones today and turn them off. Also, welcome to the crowd joining us via Zoom in the HASP virtual classroom. A special thank you to volunteer course technician Scott Travis. Please see Scott in the back, who is our Hope College liaison and executive director of alumni engagement. Scott is joined by HASP member Kay Smalley, who is in her first session as a course technician volunteer. Thank you, Kay. If you have joined the HASP virtual classroom as a participant, you have the skills necessary. You have the skills necessary to serve as a course technician, and you won't be alone. You'll be teamed with an experienced course technician to learn the simple responsibilities of this important position. If interested, please contact Hope at hope.edu for more information. Secondly, tell us what you think. You saw online the HASP Forward survey, which was built by your feedback from the HASP Forward workshops this summer and shaped by the HASP Board of Directors. It's now live. The anonymous survey should take about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. I did it yesterday. It's a snap. The only question I had was, I put that coffee and cookies weren't very important, but seeing how many of you used them, I guess I was wrong. Okay. The online survey is open today through November 22. We highly encourage you to take the survey and help shape the future of HASP. One last reminder, please hold your comments and questions until we approach you with a mic. This ensures our virtual learners and those connected to our in-class loop system can actively hear and participate. Thank you. On to Dr. James Skillen. This session is called This Land is Our Land. Dr. Skillen comes to us from Calvin. That's up, a ways, Calvin University. The other one. He is an associate professor at the university and preserve director. Dr. Skillen earned his BS from Wheaton, his MA from Gordon Cornwell Theological Sem, and his PhD from Cornell, featuring natural resource policy. He currently teaches, get this one, human modification of the global environment and society, and then special topics in environmental law. He also is a prolific writer about the environment and public lands. Last summer, we were trying to get a hold, of him, and he was out west. He tells me he does research out west. We are delighted to welcome Dr. James Skillen. Please give him a HASP welcome.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much. Is this volume good? This work? All right, excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming out this afternoon and then tomorrow for 2 sessions on federal public lands. And I'll refer to those interchangeably as federal lands, public lands. Neither is adequate, but I think both will work. Last year, I taught shared my first HASP lessons, and it was entirely virtual. This was my talk last year, God, Guns, and Patriotism. And inexplicably, more people attended. So what I want to say is clearly you all are discerning and know when there is a good topic. Curiously, this talk actually came out of my research on federal lands. And I might say a bit about that here in a minute. So I teach, as Jan said, I teach at Calvin University. I have been interested, really fascinated with federal lands since the 6th grade, when my family took the sort of obligatory trip to national parks, Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, and the like. And on that trip in 6th grade, I had a clear vision. My career path, I would be a park ranger, nay, a backcountry park ranger, living in the wilderness for 4 months of the year. it hasn't worked out that way. So I have the second best job, which is that I spend my time teaching, thinking, and writing about park rangers. The good news is I do get to talk with a lot of rangers. I also get to teach field courses. For me, it's mostly in California, Oregon, Nevada, occasionally in Arizona, where I get to take students to a variety of public land areas and introduce them to a variety of careers with 4 different land agencies. I'm also an avid backpacker. And so this is what Jan was saying. I call this research because I'm on federal lands. I'm looking at them very closely. This past summer, or 2 summers ago, actually, my son, who's in the picture in the bottom right, and we hiked the Sierra High Route, which this is the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, just east of San Francisco. And we started in Kings Canyon, all the little red dots. And the high route is not a trail. You just kind of map and compass your way right along the spine of the Sierra. And then we ended north of Yosemite. This summer, we went back and we actually circumnavigated Kings Canyon National Park. And I can tell you that my son is 6'4" and an athlete, and there is a difference of fitness level between the two. All right, so on to federal lands. We live in a country and a culture that places a very high premium on private property. Indeed, I would say where private property is a key constituent of individual identity, of status. Further, we live in a country where some of our most passionate arguments politically are about the size and scope of government, where within the Republican Party, you have staunch libertarians who would like government to be shrunk back to the size it was prior to Reconstruction. So it's curious, really curious, that in this country, the federal government, the national government, holds title to 28% of all land within the country. It's curious, and I'll note, you can see on this map, this land is located disproportionately in 11 Western states and Alaska. It's curious that in a country with a federalist system where by design, states were to be strong, the central government weak, our federal government holds title to 81% of the state of Nevada. So if you ever hear that public lands are a big issue in Nevada and not as large in Michigan, there's a reason for that. The federal government is essentially the de facto land use planner for the entire state. Now, this land, and this is really important, this land is truly public land. And I mean that in at least 2 senses. It's our land. And what that means is we have some say, some control over how it's used, how it's managed, by who we elect to office, and by what we ask them to do in directing its use. Second, most of these lands, most of what you see here, are public in the sense that the public can use them. They're open, perhaps with restrictions in some place, but they're open for any of us to go and visit. We take it for granted. It's actually a fairly radical idea. There's a good argument to be made that the United States invented the national park as we know it. If you go back in history, there have always been game preserves, pleasure parks, but they were always the domain of the monarchy, of the aristocrats. In the United States, I think was the first country to set aside parks that were ostensibly for all Americans. And I say ostensibly because if you go back in the history, there's certainly a period of time where not all Americans were welcome. Now, it is the publicness of the public lands that makes them so interesting to me. Not just to visit today, but these lands in essence are artifacts of American history and culture. They're also sites of ongoing political struggle. At one level, the struggles are about economic development versus environmental protection, or about competing ownership claims. But at a deeper level, they're structures about identity and status. Who should benefit most from these lands? What lifestyles should these lands support? After all, the federal government is subsidizing a whole range of activities and lifestyles. When I did that hike with my son, we each paid $5 for a permit to hike in the wilderness. I would say that they are certainly subsidizing my lifestyle. If you are a cattle rancher in one of the 11 Western states, you cannot effectively run a ranch without a permit to graze on public lands. So we argue about who should benefit most, what lifestyle should land support, should the lands be given to the states perhaps, or even returned to the indigenous peoples from whom they were taken, and who should influence land management the most. This actually, the book that I lectured out of last year, my last book, This Land is My Land, Rebellion in the West. And this is a book where I started writing just about federal land conflicts, about cases in particular at the time where armed militias were facing off with federal agents. And so I started thinking I was just writing about federal lands. And it turns out after I got started, I couldn't make much progress without also writing about evangelicals and Mormons in American politics, without writing about a host of cultural issues that get wrapped up in this. And you won't be able to see it in this picture, but if you look, there's a little hay barn here. And on the top of that, it says the state of Jefferson. And the state of Jefferson are a number of counties in California and Oregon that since the 40s have been trying to secede from their states and form a new state. And I think one of the things that this raises for me then is this basic question: should the federal government hold title to this much land, to these lands in particular? Should the government instead, as I said, transfer that land to other parties, except maybe for some military bases, a few of the spectacular national parks? These are the questions that I continue to study, that I wrestle with personally as well. I'm currently co-authoring an introduction to federal lands with a colleague from Notre Dame. And so today and tomorrow, I will simply condense that into, 3 hours? Not really. I will be more modest in my goals, but today and tomorrow, I'm going to try to give you an introduction, concise introduction to federal lands as an entire estate. So I'll mention different types of units, but it's really thinking about this as collective. And I'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussions so you can help direct this. And tomorrow, when I come back, I'm happy to take some orders from you, the things you want me to pick up on. Also, feel free to jump in. I think you're supposed to wait for a microphone, but feel free to ask questions at any point, and I'll pause at a few different points to allow for that. All right. So today, the starting point, starting responsibility is to try to give you a map, a mental map of federal lands in the United States. And I'll break that down into two very basic questions. First, the distribution of these lands. Why does the federal government hold title to roughly half, 50% of all lands in 11 Western states and Alaska, but holds title to only 4% of the land in the remaining states? Second, what differentiates these lands? You see multiple colors on the map. The only one color is misleading. The pink are Indian reservations that the federal government holds in trust for Indian tribes, but all the other colors on the map are designating different types or categories of federal lands. I can assure you that the federal government never had and still does not have a grand plan, a comprehensive vision for what these lands will be. Rather, over time, Congress has simply responded to different public demands by creating a wide range of categories, national parks that many of you, I'm sure, have visited, but from that all the way to the National Petroleum Reserve on the North Slope of Alaska, and I presume the name will tell you what that's for. And Congress created still other categories in which public recreation and oil drilling are both permitted. So I'll get started on these two questions. If I don't get through all of this, that's okay. We'll come back, wrap it up tomorrow. And then tomorrow I will move on to highlighting what I take to be some of the most pressing issues in federal land management today. All right, we start with the history lesson. If you look at the map of the 13 original colonies, you'll notice that some of the states look different than they do today on a map. Indeed, some are substantially larger than they are today. In the Articles of Confederation in 1881, those colonies ceded significant amounts of their western lands to the central government to be used for the good of all the states. That actually was a condition of the Confederation imposed by states like Maryland and Delaware that were really concerned that states like Virginia would have too much power within the Union. And so when Great Britain relinquished its claim to almost 600 million acres of land in 1883, roughly 237 million of those were in federal ownership. And you can see then how much those eastern states shrank. And the land that's in brown, most of that was land ceded from the British to the United States. And one of the things I like is at the time, the area that we're standing in was known as the Northwest. The US Constitution that followed gave blanket authority to the federal government to, quote, make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. The assumption in the 18th century, though, was that the government would use that authority to transfer all of that land into state and private ownership. No one at the time was talking about national parks, national forests. Rather, the government would sell land to repay its war debt, to reward military veteran, and to help support states, new states, building their infrastructure. And over the next 80 years, the federal government gained sovereignty to another 1.8 billion acres. I mean, it's a monumental amount of land. And you notice on here, at a total purchase price, this is the cash price, you have to add in the cost of war, some other things. Total purchase price of $85 million or 4.7 cents an acre. This is indeed quite a good deal. The different colors on this map are the different cessions of land. So the Louisiana Purchase, the white with the dots, and then other land that we purchased or took from through treaty with Great Britain, with Spain, and then Alaska, and Alaska was the best deal of all. The United States purchased Alaska from Russia, I believe it was 1867, for 7.2 million acres. The idea at the time was that Alaska would be really important for the United States for fur, for gold, and that would also help us expand the economy to a number of Asian countries. People at the time scoffed. Many people scoffed, called it Seward's folly after the secretary who negotiated that sale. But then oil was discovered. And now Alaska, you may know, there's no sales tax, there's no income tax, and every resident gets a check each year from oil revenue. So there was your best deal. You'll notice to this point that I haven't mentioned Native Americans who had lived in North America for millennia. I really like this map. It's not tribes, but it's a map showing kind of early Indian cultural areas, or it surrounded kind of similar families of languages. And the reason for it that I haven't mentioned them is because of the so-called doctrine of discovery. This was a doctrine under which imperial powers in Europe argued that indigenous peoples were too primitive or incapable of holding sovereignty over their land. And so when the United States gained sovereignty over all of this land, it was always only negotiating with European imperial powers. Now, what Europeans did believe, though, and the federal government believed, is that Native Americans, though they couldn't have sovereignty, they could hold title to the land. In other words, by virtue of living on it and using it, they could have title. And so the federal government gained all this land in two phases. One is what I mentioned earlier, negotiating through treaty and conquest sovereignty. And the next was actually negotiating for title to the land with indigenous tribes. Between 1778 and 1868, Congress signed 386 treaties with Indian nations. And for the next century, the federal government worked very hard to try to assimilate those tribes into European American culture and to terminate or end any self-government. Today, as a result, there are 56 million acres of Indian reservation land. These are the areas in pink. And most of this is land, as I said, that's held in trust by the federal government and managed for the benefit of the tribes. And still, in 1860, we go back to all of these negotiations, no one was thinking about large-scale federal land ownership. So, how does a government divest itself of 1.8 billion acres? This seems like a good problem to have, I guess. The democratic sentiments of people like Thomas Jefferson privileged small holdings. The idea that we should have small yeoman farmers or small property owners, arguing that that would support democracy by encouraging independence. And that was also important because the goal was to get people settled on the land to sort of prove up or secure the United States claims. And here, in facing that problem of all this land, the United States gave its first great contribution to real estate. In the Land Ordinance of 1785, Congress created or directed the creation of what we know as the rectangular survey. This is where surveyors go out. The lines on this map you see are prime meridians and baselines. And surveyors went across the nation. You notice they didn't need to survey the original colonies, but they surveyed everything else except for Texas on a rectangular survey. And what that means, and sorry, that should say Land Ordinance of 1785. Yeah, sorry about that. So what that means is, working off of those baselines and meridians, surveyors went out and divided the land into a perfect grid of slightly oddly shaped squares. So first, they divided them into quadrangles, 24 miles square that you see here. They subdivided those into townships, which here in Michigan, townships are also an area of government or a unit of government. They subdivided those townships into square miles. So you see here on the right, the township, 6 miles by 6 miles. And then here's a land plat the surveyor would have written up, and they subdivided those sections into quarter sections, half sections of land. Now, one of the things that's fascinating about this, partly sometimes when I'm at the National Archives, and I've had occasion to go through some of these, and you find interesting land claims. Found the homestead claim from Wyatt Earp once. So you're there in the archives, you're holding the same paper. But what's really interesting is these shapes are just written on a map. But when you think about the way land has been owned and developed in the United States, this same pattern is written physically on the landscape. So here's your random location in Iowa. What are those squares? Well, that goes back to 1 square mile sections. Or where I used to live in Oregon, not roads, but if you look at that square, this is actually an area where the federal government owns every other square mile of land. And so depending on how it uses and the intermingled lands use it, we see this curious pattern actually drawn into the landscape. Then Congress created the General Land Office in 1812 to serve as the nation's surveyor and realtor. It's important to understand that the rectangular survey was initially applied to states in the Mississippi River Valley, where if we go back to this, you can imagine that it makes perfect sense. Generally speaking, every square mile of land was of roughly equal value. It's fertile farmland. There are hills in some areas, But just dividing it up in this way allows for pretty uniform settlement. And so if you were, say, a farmer and you acquired 160 acres, that's a quarter section of land, that could certainly support your family. And what followed during much of the 19th century was largely a race between surveyors and settlers. I mean, this is actually from 1889, but some of the great land rushes where people would line up on a line, the gun would go off, and they would rush across a newly opened area of land to stake their 160-acre plot. And the speed with which the federal government divested its land holdings in that Mississippi River basin is really phenomenal. And despite chronic problems, I think of speculation, fraud, I would say it was largely successful. And you can see that by this is just a census map from 1860. And by 1860, the land in the eastern half of the United States, as well as parts of California, had been settled thickly enough that they'd been formed into new states. The territories that you see here represent areas that were still what the Census Bureau would call frontier. But then, settlement hit the 100th meridian. A line of longitude that runs through not the center of the country, but roughly thereabouts. And then settlement just hit a wall. Why? Well, if we look at a precipitation map, you can see that land to the east of the 100th meridian, and the 100th meridian is actually going right up here. Land to the east of the 100th meridian was wet enough that you could dry farm. Land to the west is farmed today only because of irrigation. I think this is even better. This is a vegetation map, and you don't need to see the key to recognize that probably the green means more vegetation, and probably the yellow and tan and blue mean less. And on top of that, we have land, once you hit the Rocky Mountains, that is so jumbled, it's so steep, that what is a homesteader going to do on that land? Or what's a farmer going to do? Basically, from eastern, Colorado, Wyoming, all the way over to the Cascades in Washington and Oregon, and the Sierra Nevadas in California, you had land that simply wasn't valuable under the terms that the federal government was offering it. People tried to farm kind of on those margins, and many failed. So actually, if you look at, I think it's about in Kansas, which gets about 35 inches of precipitation a year, you need 10 acres of pasture to support a cow and calf. If you're in parts of Nevada, you need 150. So even kind of livestock operations just require a scale the federal government wasn't offering at the time. I would say there was also, if you've heard the name John Wesley Powell, he was a preeminent explorer, geologist, who, among other things, floated the entire Colorado River in 1869. And he went back to Congress and said, if you want anyone to settle this land, you're going to have to offer them at least 2,500 acres. This kind of smaller units, just people aren't going to make it. And that's also the reason, this is a map, separate map showing in 1950, the specific areas of the country that had yet to be surveyed. And what that tells you is these are the areas of the country that no one wanted to settle. No one was demanding settlement. And you can see that that's much of Nevada, Arizona, Utah, parts of Idaho, because these were simply too rugged or too dry or both for settlement. Congress responded particularly in the 1860s and beyond, with a host of new laws that were designed to speed settlement back up. How do we get people out on the land? Passed the Homestead Act in 1862. Under the Homestead Act, you could gain title, ownership of 160 acres of land. All you had to do was live on it, improve it for 5 years, and it was yours for free. And that was really effective in the remaining parts of kind of the Mississippi River Basin. But again, this is not real helpful to someone trying to settle in Nevada. And the other thing Congress did to help development, which will be important for us later, is it gave an enormous amount of land through the Transcontinental Railroad Act of 1862 and others to railroad and wagon companies. This is basically how the government financed or how it resourced construction of our transcontinental railroads and a whole bunch of infrastructure. Government didn't have cash, but boy, it had a lot of land. And what's going to be important for us later is the way in which Congress gave that land to railroad companies is instead of giving them the solid corridor, it gave the railroad companies every other square mile of land. And it was supposed to be for 20 miles on either side of the track or the route, but often it was much more. The argument from Congress was that by doing this, it would stop the railroad from having complete monopoly. And the idea was the railroads would sell each of their squares, and that's how they would raise money to pay for these projects. Congress passed other laws because, and here's the key thing about that dry Western land, the land itself is not really that valuable, but there are other things of value. Ranchers would settle 160 acres by a spring, and then they'd graze their cattle on all the public lands around it. Anywhere that you found valuable minerals, this was also an opportunity to move that land into private ownership. And so Congress passed a huge number of mining laws. The most important one for us today is the Mining Law of 1872. And this is a law under which anyone, in fact, there are still places and you and I can do this, anyone can go out and stake a mining claim, typically 20 acres, and we can prospect for minerals on it. If we find there are valuable minerals, gold, silver, copper, we can take title to that. It's called patenting the land for $2.50 to $5 an acre. And you pay no royalties on those minerals. So you can imagine the billions of dollars of gold that have been transferred from federal ownership to private ownership for $2.50 to $5 an acre for the land above it. Now, this is also important because there were some problems with the law from today's perspective. One of them was miners didn't have to tell the federal government when they staked a claim. They would put something in a county courthouse. And so the federal government was really blind to what was going on. So years later, this is an actual square mile section of land in Colorado. Later, when people go to patent that land, they found that, oh, well, people have been just staking claims on top of each other in every which direction. And so adjudicating this mess has been a significant challenge. And then there were a host of other acts. The Desert Lands Act, which gave larger amounts, Timber and Stone Act, allowing people to take title to land that had those resources, and the Carey Act, which offered Western states 1 million acres each of public domain lands. And still, two things. From this map of 1890, you can see that what's in red is land that was largely settled, and what is not in red or pink is land that was still kind of frontier in terms of the population density. So still, despite all of this effort to move lands from federal ownership to state and private, the federal government had enormous real estate on its hands. In fact, in 1929, President Hoover tried to deal with this. He offered the Western states that he would give them all of the remaining public domain lands in their states to them for free. And the states said no. One governor said, these lands bring no revenue. One of the governors said it was like handing states an orange with the juice sucked out, because Hoover had offered the land, but not the minerals under it. Another governor said, the states already own millions of acres of this same kind of land, which they can neither sell nor lease and which is yielding no income. Why should they want more of this precious heritage of desert? So what's important about this Well, actually, one more thing here, which is, despite that, even in that area, dispossession of native tribes continued so that those lands at least could be open to settlement. What you see here on this map is the ancestral land of the Western Shoshone tribe, which is Nevada and California. And this is land that they never ceded by treaty, but eventually was settled and they lost. So the story, I think, heightens the question about why the federal government holds 28% of the United States. It goes a long way, though, in explaining why they're distributed the way they are. When we look at the map on the left, 1890 settlement, and we look at the federal lands map today, boy, that map is pretty close. So that when the federal government began to talk about creating national parks, creating national forests, and it looked around at the land it owned, that is, what is the pool from which it could select these scenic wonders or valuable timber? This is where their eyes fell. And in fact, if you look at these, the green here in the eastern United States, these are national forests, and then there's some national parks mixed in. All of these were lands that the federal government had to buy or took as a gift later. What it had to work with was there in the western United States. So let me just pause there and see any question in my rapid tour of real estate in America.
We had a little thing, the Sooners, remember that?
Yeah.
They had a land offering in the Oklahoma area. And the reason they're called Oklahoma Sooners is they had this starting gun where you could run off. But they had a whole raft of cheaters that were out there and had already plotted their land and everything. And that's where you get the nickname for the state, the Oklahoma Sooners. They were the people that cheated the system and went out and settled the land ahead of time. And there were a lot of bribes and things that went on that let them keep that land that they had cheated in achieving. Seems like kind of an oxymoron to have a state nickname being based on a lot of cheaters.
But successful cheaters. I think maybe that's what's being commemorated. I think if you look back in this history, it's fascinating because there's fraud all over the place. And I think that's kind of what happens when you have when you're trying to transfer that much land with very little personnel in the general land office. And there are all kinds of great stories. I mean, you had to be over 18 so to stake a homestead claim. And so, 14-year-old puts 18 on the bottom of his shoe and says, I'm over 18. I mean, it was, that's apocryphal, but the idea was this was not tightly policed. And then there are other great cases where there were separate laws for submerged land, and that was defined by land that you could navigate on a boat. And there's one famous case in California where someone put a boat on a wagon and just moved the wagon across and claimed that. But at the time, the 18th century, the federal government had not just, I shouldn't say one purpose, but the idea was getting it out of federal ownership. Accomplishing that was more important than trying to avoid some of these problems of corruption. Any other questions?
Why didn't we provide land then to the Indian population?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that the idea behind all of these negotiations is that Indians would be assimilated into European American culture. So there are cases where, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, where, Indian tribes still have treaty rights to, if not the land, they have treaty rights to hunting and fishing that they're still allowed to do. When the federal government, but with many tribes, trying to assimilate them immediately was way too hard. They were dealing with populations that were not in a cash economy, right? That did not follow a lot of European expectations. And so some of the treaties would basically take, say in the case of Oregon, the Klamath tribes, their Aboriginal territory was most of Oregon. And so the federal government would simply say, well, we can give you this small area, a reservation, if you cede the rest of it. And then it was largely in the 19th century, the goal was just getting them out of the way, right? So it was pushing them onto land, and typically, this won't surprise you, not the choicest land, right? And really then the 20th century, the efforts were to dissolve tribes as sovereign nations and just, make them regular Americans. And that includes, there are a lot of really horrific things, including removing Indian children, sending them to boarding schools. There's a lot of just, there's a shameful past there. And I'll talk a little more about that tomorrow. Thanks.
So it's interesting to me to look at this map and consider how we people valued land. And I'm not sure that it's changed that much to this day, but what you end up with at this point in time is largely land that isn't good for much else. Now, there might be some minerals. Again, we don't value it for ecosystems. If it's scenic, it's nice, right? But if it's scenic and you can farm it, the heck with it. If it's scenic and you can't farm it, that's okay. Let's make it into a national park, right? So it seems like the federal government is, I don't know if stuck is the correct term, but what they've got at this point on these maps is essentially land that nobody, in terms of our value system, feels has much of any value.
Yeah, I think if you look at many of the national parks, to your point about ecosystems, even the boundaries of those parks were drawn for scenery. So if you're concerned about ecosystems, if you're concerned about wildlife, national parks are often called the rock and ice territory, because many of the parks, the high country would be protected for scenery, the valley bottoms left open. Well, of course, if you're elk, you need both. So it really, part of the second half of the 20th century narrative that I'll talk about is once you apply an ecological lens to these lands, you really do start to face some significant problems. And once the agencies say, we do want to protect biodiversity, well, the system, isn't really set up for that. One of the things that's interesting is in the 19th century and early 20th century, the land was valued for economic development, meaning what you could extract from the land. And those Western states all had extractive economies. What drove them was timber, mining, grazing. Today, when you think about our economy, particularly, a kind of high-tech economy, now what many of those lands are valued for are the amenity or scenic value. So you think about the way a town like Phoenix has exploded. Well, it can only explode because A, you have a job that doesn't require farming, and B, you have air conditioning. So you can work for, a computer company, you can work for a bank, and all of a sudden now that land has really significant value. And similarly in Colorado, the transformation of that land from being valued for minerals and timber to now skiing and scenery. So we still look at land that way, but what we value in it has changed. Thanks.
I was just going to tell a little homesteading
Oh, great.
story. My grandmother was living in Grand Rapids in about 1906.
Okay.
And she had a younger brother who had gone out to South Dakota and wanted to be a rancher raising horses. He found some property he wanted to buy after living out there and working on this farm, but it needed water rights to make it valuable. And so he convinced his older sister to move out there and under the Homestead Act, take over 160 acres, whatever it was, that was adjacent to this ranch. She did that, stayed out there a year and a half before my grandfather, living in Grand Rapids, went out and encouraged her to come back and get married. She did that, having lived on the land for a year and a half. When my father was born in 1915, they sold the land and got a check for something like $1,500 for property that she lived on. So even the Sooners, there were other people who gained. She didn't do anything excepting the property was offered for sale, but. that's a
Yeah, thanks so
homesteading
much.
story.
That is similar to a question from one of our online learners. Could anyone graze their livestock on public land? And could anyone take water off of public land to use on their own dry private lands?
Thanks so much for the questions. So the answer is yes and yes with qualifications. Until 1934, land, what I'll call the public domain land, that is land that was not set aside as national parks or forests, kind of remaining public domain land, was a true commons. So if you had a ranch, and maybe your ranch was 160 acres, 640 acres, but yeah, there was no law prohibiting you from sending your cattle out on the surrounding hundreds of thousands of acres. In addition to that, there were massive herds of sheep, and the sheep herders kind of rotated, grazed the whole Great Basin. So there were Basque sheep herders from Boise, Idaho, who would graze west into Oregon, down through Nevada, across to Utah, and then back up to Boise, and that was their annual movement. And the courts actually affirmed this right. The court said until the federal government prohibits it, then this is legally open to that kind of use. And then we could talk more about how that changed. The water issue is really interesting because in the eastern half of the United States, we have what are called riparian water rights. And that means if you have land that's adjacent to a water body, a river, you can withdraw land, put it to beneficial use, and you can take as much as you want as long as it doesn't hurt your neighbor downstream. Of course, in Nevada, there really aren't many big rivers. And the miners who went out, 1849 and on, miners in particular needed an enormous amount of water. And the mining communities developed their own system that governments have since adopted. And that's simply prior appropriation. People say first in time, first in right. So if you arrived and no one else was on the river, you could take as much as you want. You could use it to irrigate your crops. And as long as you kept using that water, it was yours. And the Western states, because water law is actually state law, so the Western states all have these systems where the first person who got there and used that water, if they keep using it, they have a right to that amount. The second person who comes, uses water, they have the right to that amount. The third person, the fourth person. When there's a drought and there isn't enough water for everyone, the first person gets all their water, second person gets all their water, third person maybe half, fourth person nothing. So it's actually just a temporal way of allocating water. And if you look at certain areas, there are other problems with how those rights are adjudicated, because for them to be legal property rights, the state water commissions have to go through the document to see that you used it, that you took it, that you put it for correct use. But there are many cases where I lived in South Central Oregon. I mean, there were thousands of water claims that hadn't been fully adjudicated. And when it's a wet year, no problem. In a really dry year, then this became quite heated. So thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd be interested in your observation on this colorful anecdote. George Canfield in Manistee, Michigan, was the third or fourth generation lumberman up there. They owned a 13,000 square foot house, a whole city block, so on. Grandpa, or great, had 40 acres. But he didn't lumber his 40 acres. It was all federal land. So he did all theirs and gained his wealth that way. They came to get him. There's a colorful story about how they caught him and he escaped wearing his skivvies and so on. But what's your observation about that sort of thing in Michigan back in the day in the late 1800s?
In terms of timber theft. Yeah, in northern Michigan, I don't know that the history of transfer of federal to state or private ownership. The forests that we have in Michigan were created in the 30s. So you would have had, maybe it was state land, maybe it was still federal land that hadn't been transferred. But my one observation would be there would be almost no one there policing that. I mean, it's, northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, there was no federal presence. And so if you took that and, it sounds like that history, Michigan, lumber companies cut every stick of white pine in this state. I think the surveyors said that there was 156 billion board feet of white pine when they surveyed Michigan. And by the early 20th century, lumber companies had cut 164 billion board feet. So we know the estimate was low, but also nothing was left behind. So I can't imagine that in kind of that heyday too, that there was much pause to kind of consider those questions. It was, and then of course that led to the great fires in Michigan, where after logging went through, companies took the logs, they left the branches. Summer of 1871, I think it was 1.2 million acres burned across the Lower Peninsula. 1881, 75% of the thumb burned. So this state was just, wiped out. And to reiterate, I don't know the details. I'm just assuming not many people are keeping an eye on it. Yeah.
Something that started historically, but has big modern ramifications. The Imperial Valley in California, they built a diversion canal to divert Colorado Water River, and their contract said that they get first choice on the amount of water that they can take. Right now, 800 farms in the Imperial Valley are using more water from the Colorado River than Arizona and Nevada combined. And there's big battles over that right now because they say they've got a contractual right to that water and they can't grow their crops without it. They'd go broke. And they're saying that cities like Las Vegas need that water also to feed people. And there's big court cases going on right now with ramifications for something that went on in the 1920s.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the Colorado River is the lifeline of the Southwest. Cities like Phoenix, Tucson would not exist at their present size without the Colorado. And the agreement of the Colorado River Basin states on how they would allocate that was signed in 1920. And the amount that people took then was based kind of on what their demands were. Actually, Nevada got almost nothing, but the other states divvied it up. Their problem was they based their allocation of water on 20 wet years. So they estimated there were 15.4 million acre feet of water, which is a big unit. And it turns out the 100-year average is more like 13 million acre feet.
And I think it was based on that same amount of water that they signed a contract with Mexico to give them 20% of all that water coming down. We've never lived up to that contract, that treaty.
Correct. And that actually what came second treaty. So if you follow the Colorado River down, it dries up about 90 miles before the ocean. It never reaches the ocean. The one other thing I do want to say about this, to your comment about the land value, is that many of these laws just didn't take into account what we would think of as ecological issues. I mean, the word ecosystem was coined in 1934. So people weren't talking in this language, but there are ways in which the laws themselves make conservation difficult. So for example, that the water law that says you only keep the rights to that water if you remove it from the river and put it to beneficial use, meaning you irrigate something. If you stop, if you leave that water in the river for more than a couple of years, you lose your water right. So environmental groups have battled that. Native American tribes have battled that to say, look, we want to have rights to water that we leave in the river for fish. But the law is not set up for that. So there are really significant debates going on about that. Similarly with grazing law to say, is there space within this that someone could own? I mean, could buy those rights, but then use them for some other purpose.
All right, I think I've heard enough of this.
All right, well, thanks. And do let me know if there are more questions as I keep going. So the first task was to talk about the distribution. And my story was quick, but I think I could have just shown you these two maps and saved us a lot of time. The second one, though, is public land differentiation. And I just mean by that, the basic categories of federally owned lands, which is significant because those categories equate to very different land uses and very different management. Now, there are a few colors on this map that I won't talk about. Blue is Department of Defense, so I don't consider that public. It's not open to the public. I mentioned the pink Indian reservations. But the other colors on these maps are differentiating what I said, just very different land uses and management patterns. So the rest of those lands fall into one of four systems of public lands. And these lands total 615 million acres, or 27% of the United States. 27% of the land area in the United States is federal land that you can visit. That's really remarkable. And today, I'll focus on the land. So the National Park System, Forest System, Wildlife Refuge System, and National System Public Lands. Today, they're managed by these four agencies. But again, I'll mention the agencies and talk about their work, but I really want to think about the land systems each of them oversees. So let me start with the National Park System. Sorry, I'll give you a quick summary. Today, the National Park System is 80 million acres, National Forests 193, Wildlife Refuges 93 million, and the public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management 244 million. You can also, there are other interesting things on here. You can see that the agencies are not equal in budget. So which agency gets the most money per acre? Well, not the Bureau of Land Management. The most people per acre. These are very different. And some of that is understandable in terms of the specific responsibilities, but some of that is just the history of the way we valued these systems differently. So let me start with the National Park System. You've probably heard that Yellowstone National Park was the first ever created, sort of. Congress set aside Yosemite in the Mariposa Grove in 1864, but gave it to California to manage. Since I prefer the Sierra to the Rockies as a landscape, my sympathies are with Yosemite. But Congress created Yellowstone National Park in 1872. It was set aside, quote, in the legislation, as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park, and their retention in their natural condition. There are a bunch of stories about sort of what ultimately prompted Congress to act. There were a number of motives. There's apocryphal stories of people sitting around a campfire saying this would be great for the nation. There were railroad companies that saw this as an opportunity to build tourism. What I can tell you is Congress created Yosemite or Yellowstone National Park. It's roughly 2 million acres. It created it after being assured that there was very little of economic value in the park. Not great timber, no minerals. And it was created, the way I think about it, is very much as a kind of geological or zoological museum. The idea was this is a place that the public could come And they would get to see geyser like Old Faithful, boiling mud pots, hot springs like the one here in bottom. The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone that you see in this picture. And then also that they would get to see particular wildlife, bison, bear, and elk. Now, over the last 150 years, Congress has added another 62 national parks, and I'm sure you know many of their names. Sequoia National Park, Yosemite National Park, Mount Rainier, Glacier, Denali, Grand Canyon, Everglades, Shenandoah, Indiana Dunes. Building a system that, Wallace Stegner, Canadian Western writer, called America's Best Idea. That's where Ken Burns got that phrase for his docuseries on the national parks. But I need to emphasize that those are just the national parks. When I talk about the national park system, this includes a much wider variety of landscapes. So the national park system, and therefore what the National Park Service manages, include national lake shores, like Sleeping Bear Dunes, national battlefield parks, historic sites, memorials. So the Park Service manages the memorials on the Washington Mall. So like the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, national seashores. And all of these, they have different management, but all of them, I would say, are managed with the idea that the National Park Service is kind of like a museum curator, tasked with preserving the nation's natural and cultural history and interpreting it for millions of visitors each year. I should add that when it comes to the national parks and certain nature parks and monuments, in the first half of the 20th century, the agency consciously worked to locate new units in a circuit for auto tourists. The idea was we need to make sure that people don't have to drive more than a day or half day to get from one unit to another. And then it was also thinking about getting units near population centers. So Shenandoah National Park in Virginia was settled. People lived there. They were removed to create a park so that people from Washington, D.C. could have a similar experience. And the Park Service, created in 1916, has a mandate to, quote, conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So the park system is managed pretty much exclusively for recreation. The Park Service and many of these park units, don't allow logging, mining, grazing. Many of the parks, they don't allow hunting. You can only catch and release fish. In fact, if you want to know why Sleeping Bear Dunes is a national lakeshore and not a national park, it's because Congress was not going to get that approved if you took hunting and fishing out of it. And national parks all have these standards: no hunting, only catch and release fishing. So think about this as not an easy mandate, because their challenge is, how do you both preserve the things people are coming to see while facilitating millions of visitors every year? And if you've ever been to a really crowded park, you find that being shoulder to shoulder does diminish your enjoyment, and too many people trampling an area does degrade it. What I want you to think about for a minute is what preservation means and what it has meant over time. So for monuments and memorials in Washington, D.C., still the Lincoln Memorial, preservation means stasis. It means the Park Service should manage it in such a way that my grandchildren and their children will see the exact same thing that I saw. Right? This is why if you go to the Smithsonian and you look at the US Constitution, it's behind special glass with special gas inside. The idea is it should never change. The challenge, of course, is when you apply or try to apply that same mindset to natural landscapes. So if we think about the parks that were set aside to preserve scenery and wildlife, Well, these are dynamic landscapes. Floods, fire, earthquakes, river erosion, all continually reshape what visitors see. So how has the Park Service over the last century changed its understanding of preservation? And sorry, here's the mission. And up at the top, I have here from scenic preservation. The idea is we're just going to make sure that things don't change. People always get to see bison, always get to see elk. Two, when we look at the late 20th century, there's a whole different idea around preserving if we're thinking about this in ecological terms. And the same thing would be true, I think, in how we tell and retell American history, because some of those interpretations have changed. So let's start with Yosemite National Park. Sorry, that's my favorite. Yellowstone National Park, right. From 1872 to the 1950s, Yellowstone managers, Park Service, did manage it as a zoo, as a museum. The Park Service, late 19th century, early 20th century, bred bison. They grew hay in the park and fed bison during the winter. They did the same for elk. Bears, I threw a couple of pictures up here from the 1920s. I mean, bears were fun things to see. So here's Horace Albright in the middle, Park Service director, sitting down with a few bears for lunch. If you have seen older pictures from the 1930s through the 50s, the Park Service, the concessionaires would take all of the leftover food and they would put it out on a platform, and it was the bear lunch counter. And then there were bleachers, so you could go and sit and watch all the bears come and eat trash, right? It was, and because the idea was people came to see nature, and nature was the bear, the waterfall, etc. And on the left, I have a map of the park itself. And you can imagine, Henry David Thoreau once said, nature abhors a straight line. The rectilinear boundaries of Yosemite, don't follow any meaningful or helpful ecological boundary. Oh, okay, thanks. You just, every time you say that. From the 1960s on, there was a pretty substantial change within the agency, and part of that is simply what Americans came to understand as preservation. I meant to have a quote in here from environmental historian Thomas Dunlap says that environmentalism as we know it developed when people began to see through an ecological lens. And so they began to see nature not as a collection of objects, but actually as a set of relationships. And as the Park Service began to work with that, as even internal to the Park Service, their scientists began thinking differently about the landscape. The agency shifted substantially. So what you see on the right is a wolf, because the Park Service up through the early 19th or 20th century, I mean, they systematically eradicated wolves. They systematically eradicated mountain lions. They tried to eradicate coyotes. You can't. They have some special tricks. They killed grizzly bears because the idea was there were just certain things people wanted to see. If you take an ecological lens, and there's a famous report, Wildlife Management in the National Parks, 1963, where Aldo Starker Leopold says what the Park Service needs to do is maintain all of the relationships, because that is in fact what it means to preserve nature, not as a fixed entity, but that these dynamic relationships would continue. And so what happened after that is scientists in particular began looking at Yellowstone, got it right that time, through the eyes of different animals and through a kind of ecological lens. So if I go over here, one of the things, a couple of scientists, Craighead brothers, began radio collaring grizzly bears. And what they started to see is, well, what land does the bear need? Turns out, what they mapped is the red line. That's what grizzly bears, to have a healthy population, that's the land they need. And these lines are inadequate. Similarly, the Park Service was doing so much work to feed the elk, but then to kill them when there were too many, to feed the bison, kill them when they went across the line. And so by 1995, the Park Service and the public were ready to reintroduce predators. Wolves, gray wolves were reintroduced in 1995. And it's been fascinating to see the transformation. The wolves haven't necessarily altered the elk populations, but they've dramatically altered elk behavior. So before the wolves returned, a lot of stream banks were just grazed bare because elk would sit there and just eat. Immediately after the wolves were returned and they developed sufficient numbers, elk would then come to the river, drink, and then run away. So we've had willows come back, all kinds of vegetation along the banks. And so I think this is still an evolving process where the Park Service, as it thinks about its preservation role, is wrestling with a complicated question. What does that mean to preserve? And tomorrow I'll talk about how something like climate change obviously complicates that enormously, because these parks and forests are going to be changing just in the next 20, 30 years in ways that will not meet people's expectations. So we'll get back to that. But today, and then I would also say that the Park Service has also worked and really struggles with a different sense of how to tell the cultural story of the United States. If you go back to, certainly the 19th century, as I was explaining, the treatment of Native Americans, I would say was just basically immoral. But, throughout the 20th century, if you went to the parks, you probably wouldn't see much acknowledgement at all that certain tribes had lived there for millennia. There would be a few like Yosemite, but many of them, that was just a narrative that never made it into the interpretive material. Similarly, the picture on the left, there are stories of African Americans in the national parks that were essentially invisible. I mean, the parks, many of them were segregated, as with the rest of the United States. And so the narrative of the kind of triumphal narrative of, look, great people saved beautiful places. It's not that that's wrong. It's just grossly incomplete. And so what the Park Service is struggling with now is, how do you tell the story of these landscapes? How do you tell the story of the United States in a way that does some justice to marginalized voices? I know the associate director of the Park Service for interpretation, visitor service, something else, Calvin grad. But Tom Medema he came up through the ranks. He was in Yosemite, up in Alaska. He's worked in all different parks. And he came to one of my classes and a student asked, so what's a week in the life? What do you actually do as associate director? He said, I spend 20% of every week, at least 20%, working on 2026. We thought for a minute. Right, this is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. And he said, it wasn't easy in 1976, but it's gotten a lot harder in an age of equity and inclusion. So he anticipates this is going to keep growing each year, because how do you tell a complex story and still tell it in a way that's concise enough that it can be meaningful? And so I think that the Park Service struggles then both with the complexity of the non-human world and also with the complexity of American history. We move on to the Park Service, the Forest Service. And, oh, by the way, the Park Service, we start with them. The Park Service also is the most powerful. All the other agencies kind of grumble because the Park Service gets what they want. They get the appropriations they want. When Newt Gingrich in 1995 in the contract with America, he went to try to eliminate some national parks to cut government spending. I think he got an angry letter from every child, every elementary school child, and probably, every parent and grandparent in the United States. You don't touch the parks. And so they do have a special, not only a special status culturally, but the parks enjoy a level of political support that the other land areas don't get. So good for them, but sad for the Bureau of Land Management. So the national forests and grasslands, whereas the parks were established to protect land from economic development, the national forest system was created initially to protect land for economic development. The problem was not a kind of economic lens. It's that in the 19th century, there were a number of elite Americans who were crying that the United States was headed toward a timber famine. They had been watching, after all, what happened in New England and the Great Lakes. And there was a cry that said, we need a different way to manage forests to ensure that we have timber next year, in 50 years, in 100 years. And so in 1891, responding to that outcry, Congress intervened and authorized the president to create forest reserves that would protect timber supplies for the nation. It was kind of odd in that there was nothing else. There was no agency. There was no real purpose. It was just, you can create these reserves. In 1897, Congress passed the Organic Act, and it identified two primary purposes for these forest reserves. They were securing a permanent supply of timber for the people and ensuring conditions favorable to continuous water flow. I have here a map on the left. Benjamin Harrison, 1893, created some forest reserves, but really Teddy Roosevelt, and now we're at 193 million acres, so there have been a lot of forests created. But Teddy Roosevelt sort of holds the award for most forests created. And he exercised this authority, creating millions of acres of new national forests, to the point that Congress got upset and passed a bill that eliminated his authority to create national forests. So he and the chief of then the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, sat down, apocryphally, the bill next to them. He had until midnight to sign it. And so he and Gifford Pinchot spent the day creating new national forests before he signed the bill that eliminated his authority. He created, I think it was just that day, 20 million acres of new national forests. Now, when those were created, try to picture, right? We got 1908 here. Pinchot and Roosevelt are in Washington. There's no satellite imagery. So the way that some of these boundaries were drawn was based on the best maps they had. They were just sort of creating national forests. And you can see there on the West Coast, protecting the rich Doug fir forests of the North Cascades, the Coast Ranges, forests in the Northern Rockies, the Southern Rockies. And at the time, this is what's interesting and kind of the foresight here. At the time, there really wasn't much demand for timber in most of these areas. Most of the timber was still coming from the east, but it was, let's lock down some of these Western lands before they get clear cut like the rest of the country. And then in 1905, Congress created the U.S. Forest Service, and the first Forest Service chief, Gifford Pinchot, didn't like the name Forest Reserves because it sounded like something that would be reserved from use. So the names were changed to the National Forests because Pinchot said they're for use, they're for timber. And over time, that grew. But a really significant thing for us in Michigan is that when Congress looked across the eastern half of the United States, there were millions of acres of cut over forests where it was just soil was eroding. The counties and the states had no money to replant. And so in 1911, under the Weeks Act, Congress authorized the Forest Service to buy or to accept as gifts cut over forested land east of the Mississippi. So all of the forests you see there in the east were all kind of acquired after 1911. That's also why if you go up to, say, the Manistee National Forest and you see how it's not one contiguous plot of federal land. There are private lots here and there are houses there. It's because what the federal government received from the state and counties, or what they bought, was just what was available. So these eastern forests tend to have a lot more private property inside the gross boundaries than do the ones in the west. And yeah, I think all of our Michigan forests, I think, were created in the 1930s following that act. So today there are 193 million acres of national forest. And the Forest Service, though, went through an even more dramatic transition or evolution than the Park Service in how it manages these lands. The early Forest Service was staffed almost exclusively by foresters. In fact, those foresters had pretty much all gone to Yale School of Forestry, which, by the way, had been founded by the Forest Service chief. And the Forest Service chief also wrote the Journal of Forestry, edited that. And so you had an agency that was, I mean, the Forest Service for years was one of the most respected agencies in the federal government, and they delivered remarkably consistent decisions from Utah to Washington because the people employed by them had such a kind of homogeneous training and view. I will say, and this is important, really important, if you get nothing else, that Yale School of Forestry says they're the first forestry school in the country. They're not. They are the first school of forestry in the country that still exists. So Cornell, where I went, had the first school of forestry. And it was founded by Bernard Furneaux, who trained Gifford Pinchot. And when Furneaux started that school, right at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, the state of New York gave him funding, and they gave him 30,000 acres in the Adirondacks. Furneaux, Prussian born and trained, went up there and saw these horrible hardwoods. What could you do with hardwood trees? So he started to clear cut them and replace it all with white pine, Norway spruce. His only problem was that he was doing that in an area right around the great camps of the Rockefellers, the Gettys. And they'd never seen anything so ugly. So they convinced the state to shut down the school, take back that land. It's now in the forever wild category. And when SUNY, State University of New York, finally decided it needed a forestry school again, the only condition is that it couldn't be at Cornell. And that's why it's at Syracuse. But I am obligated to be bitter about that. So the Forest Service really started with this singular focus of economic production of timber and protecting watersheds, not in an ecological sense, but in the sense of ensuring there isn't too much erosion that would damage people's drinking water and damage fisheries. But even early on, the Forest Service recognized that, one, people recreated in the forests, and they were also motivated to serve recreational interests. Why? Well, because Congress took forest land to create national parks. So the Forest Service figured we got to show that we can do what the Park Service does and do it just as well so that we don't keep losing land. And over time, the Forest Service continued to expand its mission and its work to include a lot more in terms of wildlife protection, fisheries protection. Yeah. And in fact, Aldo Leopold, if you know that name, he spent much of his career in the Forest Service. And in 1924, he convinced the Forest Service to create the first wilderness area, which is down the Gila Wilderness area in New Mexico. And his argument was there needed to be places where one could take a 2-week pack trip. So you get on a horse and you could just go for 2 weeks and not be disturbed. He was. Yeah, he was. He started out the same way as Pinchot and evolved considerably. Thanks. And so over time, the Forest Service's mission has expanded, and it was codified by Congress in 1964, 1976. And the national forests now fall under what they would call multiple use management. So their mission statement is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. So the challenge for them is different from the Park Service in that the Forest Service is trying to appease or trying to meet a much wider range of demands. The Forest Service sells timber, they allow mining, they build a lot of roads, they allow grazing, but they also have wilderness areas. There are backpackers, there are campers. One of the Forest Service chiefs, McArdle, in 1954 said that basically they knew they were doing the right thing if everyone was angry. It's a challenging mission to have. And so, you get just a sense of a variety of activities. By the way, this is a prize Forest Service area. This is the Maroon Bells in Colorado near Aspen. Great stuff. What's that? Yeah, and you can't get a ticket for the bus because they sell out. It's crazy. By the way, if you hike in from the south, there's no restrictions. So I check these things. All right, so let me stop there because we're at time, and I'll move on to the others, Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management. But I think we have a couple minutes if you have for a question or two. Your first slide and the girl holding the Bible got my plate. By the way, it was interesting that book. We'll get back here. That book I finished in May of 2020, and I had been writing about the rise of militias, and particularly militias in federal lands. And I'd looked at militias in Michigan and elsewhere. And I remember in May of 2020 kind of thinking, boy, I hope we've hit bottom. Not so much. Not so much. Yeah, any other questions I could take? Otherwise, I'll pick that back up tomorrow. Oh, and one of the things, is there anything that tomorrow I'll talk about the other two agencies or land systems, and then what I take to be some of the big issues with federal lands. But is there anything else you would like me to come back with tomorrow?
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about water rights and preservation of water. Last summer, my husband and I camped near the Sun Valley. We went to Crater of the Moons National Park. But one of the things that we really noticed there, and we saw some publications that they had, like newsletters around in the area with concerns about water, and everywhere we looked, water was running 24 hours a day in order for them to do any kind of farming. And some of the concerns in these newsletters that we saw were the fact that the aquifers were extremely low and they were becoming salty, and so that kind of thing, maybe you could address some of that.
Sure, happy to. Did you want to add to that?
In conjunction with that, I'd appreciate it if you could talk about water use tomorrow. And what I mean by that is recreational use or commercial use. For example, when I grew up in the 50s, there was commercial fishing on Lake Mactaw and Lake Michigan, and then they hit a parallel below that you can't do it, yada, yada. But also, obviously, the country grows along water lines as transportation. I'd appreciate hearing how some of those things went away in some places, and how in other places, how they continue, and just not our state, but nationally.
Sure. Yeah, I'll say that sometimes in some of the field courses that I've taught, if I'm going to discuss water rights, I take Amtrak with students, because at Calvin, and I hope is similar, I think most of our students are from east of the Mississippi. And if you live in Michigan, which is near 80% of the surface freshwater of North America, 20% of surface freshwater in the world, it's hard to appreciate water as a scarce resource. But if you get on the train and you take it from either, there are two routes from Chicago to Reno or Chicago to Portland, you're basically spending 2 days watching the country dry out. And it's not a lot, but it is a starting point because that entire context of ecologically sustainable water use is really different in Michigan than in Idaho or Arizona. So thanks. I will come back and add some things on water tomorrow. Appreciate it.
I'd love to hear more about conversations about indigenous
Sure.
people. What are the conversations right now, especially with treaties that were violated or forced treaties? Are there communications or conversations about returning some, expanding?
Sure.
Thanks.
I will do that. Thank you.
I guess you need to come back tomorrow.
I think I will, but I'm going to leave earlier now that I know,
Yeah.
now that I
let
know
me-
about traffic.
Yes. We have plenty of water. We just have too much traffic at the moment, or construction sites. So thank you very
Thank
much,
you very
Dr.
much.
Skillen.
Thank you.
We will see you all tomorrow.